Well, there's two levels at which you answer that question. The purely conceptual level, what is national identity? And then the American experience, with which I am most familiar. The U.S., let me just say that national identity broadly is about the construction of this imagined community, to use the scholarly term for it, into a population that has a shared history, shared experiences that define, mold, and continue to allow groups to reproduce themselves with an emotional tie. So you're attached to this national identity, and the good politicians learn how to use that meaning, how to use that attachment. The demagogues use and abuse that identity. But it's real, but it has limits. That is, there's got to be a boundary condition, because you could never convince a Chinese that he's a Greek. So there's a real thing out there that you can put together. So it is an imagined community, but it's imagined community within constraints. And that's what a national identity consists of and comes into being. In the U.S., it's much more complicated and yet much simpler. We don't have a national identity because we don't have a national history. We don't go back like the Italians or the French or the English. We don't have this long trajectory. We go back to the 17th century in some way, if you want to include the Indians. But they aren't part of this national identity except post facto. So what we have in the U.S. is a created, imagined community that is purely political. Quintessentially a political construction. And you have to share a belief in these political principles. Now, more important than sharing a belief in these political principles, it's you share a rhetorical commitment, because you violate them all the time. All men are created equal. Well, we never did that. Blacks were never people until the Civil War. They were 3/5, as a simple example. Indians didn't become adults until 1924, I think it was, when you allow them to be adults. Until then you treated them as children. So you made decisions on their behalf, because children can't make decisions. So we constructed a political community, not a cultural community. Now, this political community had cultural components, but even that was very tentative. For example, it is quite noteworthy that the defenders, advocates of English only, forget the Constitution says nothing about language. And why does it say nothing about language? Because at the time the Germans were very important. And if you had tried to make English the official language, Pennsylvania wouldn't have joined the Union. And if Pennsylvania hadn't joined, you wouldn't have had one. So politics came into the construction right up front. Don't talk about language, make blacks non-people, but all men are created equal. And so you create this myth, and then you attach these cultural components, primarily language. Lately, I think negatively important way, we've attached religion, we've put it back in. Now, we fought a lot to get it out, and now we've put it back in. So if you think about politics today, it is much more likely that a black man could be elected president than a man who stood up and said, I don't believe in God. He'll never win, at least not for the foreseeable future. So we've learned to accept homosexuals, we've learned to accept women, we've learned to accept blacks, more or less. You got to be a Christian. You got to be a Christian. Jews maybe, but you really ought to be a Christian. whatever denomination you want. So that's a cultural component. All right? Once we do that, then we celebrate the multicultural dimensions of America. What's a typical American dish? Well, if you separate out barbecue, which is a black dish, I suspect, out of poverty, you have pizza, great American dish, chop suey, another great American dish. Now you have tortillas, another great American. What the hell do we have, right? We don't have turkey. Maybe turkey at Thanksgiving, maybe. But that's an Indian contribution to cuisine, all right? So culturally, we celebrate this variation because we don't have an essence. The French never ask, what does it mean to be French? We always ask this question because it's a legitimate question. And what it means to be American is to be intensely patriotic. So that we have this strange thing of going to a football game and singing the national anthem. Of all crazy things, why would you do that? Why would you have a political celebration at a football game, right? I don't know. It became an issue more recently when we had a soccer game in L.A. and the U.S. national soccer team played the Mexican soccer team. Mexicans are much more passionate about their soccer than Americans. And the American players said, God, it felt like we were in a foreign country. We weren't the home team. Well, in fact, all the Mexicans there were Mexicans. They weren't Mexican Americans. They were Mexicans. And it's not surprising that the Mexicans supported the Mexican team. And the Americans were, in fact, the foreigners in this game. But it was a shock, right? All of this to say that we don't know culturally what we are because we celebrate all the things that we are, but we are ultimately a political nation.